Hello and welcome to Module 6 of the short course on risk assessment for food safety. This module is still about the second step of risk assessment, which is exposure assessment. And in this, we will cover the task related to estimating the amount of food consumed as a part of the exposure assessment. So the learning objectives for this module are to understand how the information on the amount of food that people consume is used in an exposure assessment and ultimately in a risk assessment. Also to understand the type of data that is used to estimate the amount of food a person consumes. And then we are going to talk about combining the information on the amount of contamination in a food with the amount of food a person eats to come up with estimates of exposure. So exposure assessment, again, as I mentioned last time, is a step in which we assess how much of a contaminant a person is exposed to through food. So we're looking for this rate, this idea of how much contaminant per day is the person being exposed to. So this time we're talking about, last time we talked about how much of a contaminant is in the food, and today we're going to talk about how much, or in this module we'll talk about how much of each type of food does a person eat. So estimating how much food is being consumed is something that requires a lot of data that was collected primarily for this purpose. And we know that if we have information about how different parts of the population consume different types of foods, it would be important to have data from each of those populations. Whenever you try to estimate from data that's not relevant, then you're bringing uncertainty into the equation. You're likely to have different consumption rates by different subpopulations. For example, children versus adult, maybe elderly would have different rates of food. So knowing how to divide up the population and come up with those estimates based on different consumption patterns is an important part of this data collection, so that you're making sure that you have data from each of the relevant subpopulations. So there might be consumption data available nationally or regionally. We do know that in Ethiopia there is some consumption data collected by the Ethiopian Public Health Institute. And as I was mentioning in the previous slide, data should be collected in a way that accounts for variability in individuals as well as variability in one individual's day. So you might have different trends over time that some people, so things like fasting days obviously would be taken into account. If there's some people that have different consumption patterns based on their religion or based on their culture or based on their work, their school, whatever situation is causing them to change their consumption patterns, you'd want to have information from each of those different populations to be able to come up with your consumption estimates. So again, as I mentioned, when we talked about measuring the amount of contamination in foods, there's going to be variability and uncertainty in these estimates, and you'd want to take that into account in your models in terms of uncertainty. We talked about uncertainty in the risk-based decision-making module and how important it is to incorporate that into your risk assessment models. So when you only have point estimates, when you only have the one example I gave last time about having 3 chicken sandwiches a day, when you only have that number and you don't have an estimate for how that might vary, then you're limited in terms of the ability to put uncertainty estimates around these risk assessment estimates. So an example of consumption of a data point from the United States, and these are based on surveys and studies that are done on a regular basis. And this is from a 2017 data point, I think, that people in the United States on average eat 1 cup of fruit per day, but you might say, well, that really varies from a half a cup to 4 cups a day, depending on what the data was. So you have this consumption estimate, and then you want to have the uncertainty around it. So in terms of the risk assessment modeling, you often present exposure in terms of these probability estimates. And so I wanted to provide an oversimplified model of what fixed consumption is. So I'm taking the uncertainty out for a minute to kind of demonstrate what this calculation would look like. So say you have data that tells you that cheese, this is putting it all together now into this model. You have an estimate that a person on average eats 8 grams of cheese per day. And then you also have information that cheese has a concentration of 2 micrograms per gram of this certain contaminant. So you have these 2 data points. So then you would estimate exposure by multiplying those together. So you would take the amount of contamination times the amount of consumption and come up with an estimate of 0.016 grams of contaminant X per day. This is from cheese. If this contaminant is in other kinds of food, you would also need to get those estimates for the other kinds of food and then add it all up together to see how much of contaminant X is a person being exposed to per day from their food. So that's a real quick overview of exposure assessment. So I hope that kind of introduced you to the idea of how the amount of food that people consume is used in exposure assessment, what kind of data would be used to estimate that, and then how that would be combined with data on contamination to estimate overall exposure estimates to that contaminant through food.